Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Today, I am told that I'm in the hot seat.
Yes.
Our viewers get to ask me a few questions, so I will do my very best to answer these questions. So what do you have in store? Have you received a few questions for me?
I enjoy doing it because I think it's a lot of fun and I learn something every time. We have such a huge response whenever we put this out. We put it out just a little bit of time ago. And we got so many good questions. You don't even have a cheat sheet I see over there.
Sure.
So let's cut to the chase then, and let's take a look at the first question we have from our viewers. This is from Evan Webb, and he asks, under a free market healthcare system, how would you guarantee people wouldn't suffer simply because the treatment is unaffordable?
Well, my guess is that he probably has a hint on that answer for that, because if you want to worry about unaffordability of medical care, look at Obamacare and look at what the premiums are doing and look at the services. So, yes, I think it's an interesting question because I've had the experience of practicing medicine both in when it was still pretty free market, and I got out of medical school in 1960, so that was still before Medicare and Medicaid. There was some government, but it was minimal, and you either paid your bills or you had your own insurance, and it wasn't so much, the big corporations that worked with government taxing programs to provide the health care. So it wasn't a worry. I think it's a worry now that it's unaffordable when you either can't get it or cost too much, and that's been a consequence. The more government we've had, the more expensive it's been. But sometimes the costs are hidden. If you can regulate insurance and regulate government taxation, some people who need medical care, they don't even realize what it might be costing. But if you want to have the maximum amount, the best medical care, you have to have a freer market, and that's what we don't have. We have monopoly control of medication, of medical care, whether it's the drug companies or whether it's the insurance companies. So the first thing is, I don't think you can have, it's not going to be perfect. It never was perfect, even when there was a lot less government. So that doesn't happen. It's not going to happen. But if you want the best care, it has to be the way we deliver still a lot of products in this country in the market, where there's competition and where prices are always driven down rather than up. Even in medicine, we know when the market is there, market is working, there are people who are modest income people who really want to have LASIK surgery done or some plastic surgery done. And lo and behold, the doctors accommodate, they do it, they extend credit, they give discounts, and prices keep coming down. And that's what would happen in free market medicine. But the scare tactic is they'll be out in the streets and nobody will have health care. And I've said so many times in talking about health care that one of my first jobs after I got a medical degree was working at the Santa Rosa Hospital in San Antonio. And it was a church hospital. And, they paid me, really nice little wage of $3 an hour. But I was learning. I was still just out of school. But nobody ever got turned away. So I think medical care would be more extensive. The place where it's hard to argue this is where there's a mandated service and somebody has a serious illness and he has to change his company or something, and if you just allowed the market to work and say, oh, well, we don't want to cover you because you have a pre-existing condition, but that's all a consequence of government interference. If we were in a free market, we would be insuring our children very young. They'd pay insurance and hopefully never use it for 20, 30 years. The insurance companies could calculate that, but the insurance would stay with them, and it would be for catastrophic insurance, and you would never be paying for the office calls. When I started my medical practice in private practice in 1968, the office call was $5. But people had $5, and but it's the more the government got involved, the higher the expenses went. And when government is involved, everybody charges the most. The doctors get more careless, and whether it's an insurance company or the government, they charge the maximum instead of charging the least. And the insurance companies charge lowest, drug companies, the pharmaceuticals cost more, and laboratories charge more, hospitals charge more, and there's all kinds of things. But that is all a consequence of government. So if we want the best quality service at the best price, we ought to have enough confidence that the best way to distribute medical care is the same way we distribute so many other things, where prices go down, whether they're cell phones or your opportunity to buy a hamburger, Oh, my God, you're not going to distribute like hamburgers. But there's no monopoly control. There's competition, and there's too much monopoly control in medicine, whether it's a drug company, the insurance company, healthcare, and the medical profession. Because there's not a lot of people who know a lot about medicine could provide a lot of good medical care as long as they don't lie about their qualifications. So it's a real shame for us to look at it, those of us who understand the market and medicine, on what has happened. And right now, I don't see a quick solution coming with the debate going on in Washington right now.
That's for sure. Well, let's go to number 2. This is from, if we can get it up on the screen. This is from Liberty Kid, and it says, how can we have tax reform without spending reform? Is it worth not cutting taxes if we will not cut spending? Good question.
Well, there was a little talk I gave on the House floor once that spending is a tax. So it is, we do separate the two. The spending is here and the tax is up here. You spend too much, you tax. But it's not that simple. Because if you don't have the money, you borrow the money, and that's a cost, and somebody else pays it for it later on. A 10-year bond, people in 10 years pay for it. But what if they still don't get enough borrowing? The system is they just print a treasury bill in a computer, really, and they create the money out of thin air, which is a tax. So it's a cost, and it's immediately there. But the reason why this is an interesting question is the important thing is the spending. If we don't deal with the spending, then we're always going to have a tax problem. So but the question does come up in a practical sense of, the argument, and sometimes the supply siders versus the libertarians will say, and some will argue, well, you can't lower taxes because you'll increase the debt. And there's some truth to that, but somebody might argue, yeah, but you're increasing the debt, but you're delaying it, and it keeps the bubble going for a while longer. But I think the biggest problem is the spending. And I keep reminding myself, all spending is a debt. It always gets paid for, and it's always paid for unfairly. The rich don't pay for these things, even though they pay more income tax. The real tax is the loss of jobs, the people who are permanently unemployed, the people who have to pay higher prices and can't afford it. And right now, there's hollering and screaming. People don't have enough money to pay their bills. And of course, the government tells us there's no inflation, so they don't get any cost of living increases in their Social Security and different things. But there's a lot of inflation. But the one thing is, if you don't concentrate on the spending, then what you're going to end up with is the inflation tax. And this is the thing that I have frequently said, is that the Austrian School of Economics, and in particular Mises, said that if you do this, you will destroy the middle class. It happens every time you destroy a currency, that the people who really suffer, and I thought it was so dramatic in this last recession. That's generally true gradually and steadily, but especially in the last bailout. The wealthy got bailed out. They had been making billions anyway, and then foreign banks got bailed out, foreign governments got bailed out, but still the average person who lost their home, even today the conditions are so messed up that it's very difficult for a lot of people not to be able to buy a house. And they say, oh, the millennials, they don't buy houses because they're a different society and they don't care. I don't believe that for a minute. They don't, because they don't qualify, and people have tightened up because of the past housing bubble. bubble. But in spite of all that, there's still a lot of manipulation. There still is going to be another housing bubble. There's many bubbles out there. It's one big bubble, and it comes from this whole question of taxes and spending. My rule in Congress was, if I had just a vote to cut taxes and don't deal with the spending, I would vote to cut the taxes. And somebody would say, well, you'll increase the deficit, but it won't matter whether you, if you don't want to increase the deficit and you can't raise the taxes. But if people keep spending and taxing the people through inflation, there's always going to be a tax there. But I would always vote to lower taxes because I think that's the real culprit. But behind that culprit is the bigger one. What should the role of government be? And it's the spending that we have as a society endorsed, thinking that we can do it forever, but forever is getting close to ending.
Okay, we'll go on to number 3, and I like this one a lot. I think it's an interesting question. If we can get it up on the screen. It's from Landry Harmon. Is there any government's economic or foreign policy that you like? We're always pretty critical here, so that's a good question. If so, which one?
Well, in this country, I can think of a few small groups of society that are very responsible and take care of themselves. Take the Amish and the Mennonites. They don't get involved in this. And matter of fact, they provide in a voluntary, collective way for their medical needs. Everybody chips in, but that's because they're culturally one unit, but they're self-governing. They're much more self-governing, and they try to avoid some of the shortcomings of our modernized society. But it does work. And this is what we used to have. And of course, when the country was founded, governments were very small. It was intended that the states would be small. But of course, that doesn't happen. And we have to criticize what's going on, whether it's the income tax, is the Federal Reserve spending too much, too many wars and all this. And it is true. And somebody says, why do you have to be negative? You shouldn't be that. It has to be always positive. And I do. I speak about positive things a whole lot. But somebody told me once, never feel bad about it. Think of yourself as a fireman. You're coming here and you're trying to put the fire out, and that is very, very, very positive. But internationally, there's not a whole lot we can go to. Even the people that we throw out a few suggestions that they're doing the right things, it's very rare. But the one country that I think has done well has been Switzerland. Recently, they've backed off a little bit from the soundness of their currency. They held on to independence, the Swiss franc. If you ever look at a chart someday of the comparison of the Swiss franc and the U.S. dollar since 1971, and it's straight down for the dollar. And the Swiss franc has been a much stronger currency. But why I like it is nobody can remember who the president of Switzerland is, because their executive essentially doesn't exist, and they have managed to stay out of war. And that to me is fantastic. But they say, well, it's probably because they're protected by the mountains. Yeah, in this day and age, they're protected by the mountains. But they're protected by a system where they have always stayed neutral in war. And when you think of the 20th century with World War I and World War II, where Europe was blowing up, literally, they still existed and they still had their independence, and they don't send troops to Iraq and these different places like we do. I think they would probably, I haven't looked at it, they may even have a problem with migration now. They might have been drawn in from this, but basically they're not seen as the culprits of helping to contribute this in the Middle East. So I think if people want to look for a system that has worked, where it's independent and smaller and emphasizes individual responsibility, I think Swiss sets a pretty good example.
Yeah. Well, here's next one is from EW Journal. Coming up, and it says, Representative Massey calls for a Fed audit. You've been asking for years. Will the Fed finally be audited?
Well, let's hope so, because last week, of course, the committee, banking committee, passed it out. To have the Fed audit, essentially the same bill that I had for a good many years. Tremendous progress on the Fed issue, and I compare it to where we were in the 1960s, 70s when I first went. Nobody knew about the Fed or cared about the Fed, and it was mysterious, and it was politically incorrect to even mention the Fed. But things are a lot different now. A lot of people know about it, especially since the last crisis that we had, because the Fed got involved with QEs and bailing out to the tune of trillions of dollars, and it hasn't helped the economy. And they created the bubble. Before, they were never blamed for creating any problem. It always says capitalism causes downturn. The Federal Reserve protects us, and they boost the economy. So that's why they had the dips, the Fed saving us from capitalism. But that isn't true. They cause the booms, and they cause the bust. But we don't know enough about it. The big secret is what they do with foreign sources. We know that trillions of dollars were transferred and manipulated and moved around during the last crisis, up to $15 trillion. But we never know the details of it, and they don't want us to be involved. They say, well, we don't want to politicize it. Well, it's politicized by a small group of people, and they're not actually officially recognized by government. So they're very much involved. They don't want us to know really what's going on, who benefits from this tremendous power. And our central bank, the Federal Reserve, is much more powerful than any other in the history of the world, because now we have the most globalistic economy ever, and the dollar is still the kingpin, but although not as strong as it used to be, and it eventually will fail. And that's why we need to know about it. Will they really get a thorough audit? I have my doubts. Let's hope. But sometimes, presidential candidates will say they support something, and then they fade away, and they have a different opinion, even on medical care. And right now, although our current president said he'd go along with an audit, we'll have to wait and see. We'll see even if the House leadership will allow it to come to the floor and be voted on. And then we'll go through the Senate, and then would the president sign this? And a lot of people will support it if they know darn well it's never going to pass, because they know there's a lot of us out here now very concerned about the Federal Reserve, and we should know more about it. But I don't think it's an important question. It's important we keep working on that. It's important that we work to get rid of the Federal Reserve. But the odds of us getting the vote and the political momentum that we can challenge the banking system and the military-industrial complex, all these people, they're big-time supporters of the Federal Reserve. So the odds of us getting enough political clout in Washington to gradually wean ourselves off this thing, I don't think it's not very good. But there's a very good chance that we may well see, and not the very distant future, that there will be an elimination of the Fed by its own doing. When I think of the elimination of the Soviet system back in the 70s and 80s, that it would disappear and it would be a benign event, not many people were saying it, not many people would believe it, and because it was a failure, economically it failed. This system we have is failing. We have the reserve currency. It will fail. The big question is are we going to be smart enough as a nation and as individuals to make sure our governments give us the right to use sound money, which has been traditionally for 6,000 years gold and silver. They haven't repealed that yet. So I think that there's room for optimism, but we still have important things to do. Thomas Massie deserves a lot of credit for the work he's carried on, all our friends who have pushed on this, and I'm glad they're still discussing it.
Okay, we have time for one more short one, I think, and this is this would be a let's make-believe question. It's going to be, if you've got the power. This is Cameron Kahn, who writes in. We'll skip the second one for now. The first one, if you were president right now, what would be the first change you make?
Oh, the first change. Well, the first thing you have to realize is, in our system today, the president is not an absolute dictator and can't, do that overnight. But what would be the philosophic and legislative change that I think would do the most good? And that would to be root out the tax system. Get rid of the ability of government to tax us. And then there would be then there would be no way that they could spend the money. But just a little while ago, we were discussing about they spend, they tax, they run up debt and all. But when I say no more taxes, I include the inflation tax. So if we could stop the inflation tax, stop the income tax, we would make the point that individuals are sovereign people. They have a right to their life. They own their life, and they should own the fruits of their labor. But right now, that isn't the case. It all goes to the government. And even when they talk about tax cuts right now, what they're saying, what they always say is it has to be a neutral tax. If you cut here, you have to raise over here, saying, well, you don't want to penalize the government. The government has a right to this. So we work on this assumption that the government owns us, and they tell us how much we can keep. So if I had the wand of changing the ideas, I would say that the government no longer owns us, and therefore they have no right to steal from us, and taxation is theft, and therefore that would be a different world. And then the government would shrink, and that's when I would be a happy person.
All right, well, you're out of the hot seat now.
All right, and I want to thank our audience for tuning in today, and hopefully you'll come back soon and spread the message.